Hey everyone, welcome to another tutorial. In this one, we're going to be building dynamic forms with Htmx and showing how you can use Htmx to achieve the same effect that you would using Django Formsets. So if you prefer to read instead of watch the video, then you can find the link to the blog post down in the description of the video. And the finished code for this project is also in a GitHub repository, which is in the link in the description. So with that being said, we can get started with the tutorial. So I'm going to be starting this project from scratch, just create a virtual environment. I'm going to use virtual env and then just activate it. And we're going to first install Django. This is going to be the latest version right now, which is 3.2.6. If you're watching this in the future and it's a different version, then you might want to just install this version that I'm using by just putting the double equal signs and then completing the tutorial and then upgrading to the latest version after the tutorial. But so once you've got that installed, you can then run the Django admin start project command, and I'm just going to call this Htmx Django or Django Htmx, and then I'll just open this in VS Code. Right, so we've got the Django Htmx folder here, and just to get everything started, first I need to reactivate the virtual environment. So I'm just going to do that, and then I will change it back into the Htmx folder, and we're going to run the manage.py migrate command to apply the initial migrations, and then I'll create a super user as well, and I'm just putting in some basic password. Right now I can go and run the server as well, just to get that running, and then I will open this up here. Okay, so that's running. Now, the HTMX documentation you can find on htmx.org, so you will want to keep this open just to read along or just to use as a reference. And really, you can find everything about HTMX here. It's really good documentation. So we'll refer to this throughout the video just to explain some concepts. But okay, so that's set up. Now I'm just going to stop the server, and I'm going to run the start app command, and I'm just going to call it books, and we'll just use books as an example for this tutorial just because books are pretty simple. And so now that we have the app, I'm just going to go and put that into the settings.py. So we can go here and we'll go to the installed apps, and then we'll just add the books app over there. Right, so inside the books models.py, I'm just opening this with some shortcuts. I'm going to paste in some code that is already written, and it's not really related to the tutorial, it's just to get us started. So here it's two models, an author and a book, and the idea is that an author can have as many books, so we've created a foreign key from the book to the author model, and it just has two fields, the title and the number of pages. This is just to get us started so we can use this. So we have those two models, and then I'm going to go into the admin.py and I'm going to register the models in here so that we can just see how this looks in the Django admin. And so I'm using the tabular inline from the Django admin for the book model, and what this does is it allows you to specify inlines on another model admin so that you can use this as an inline form set. And if we first run the migrations, then we can see this in the Django admin. So make migrations and then migrate and then run the server. And we'll go into the Django admin and log in with the super user credentials. All right, so there we can see the author's model, but not the books model. And that's because if we go here, let's create just one author, for example, we could call it Bob. And you'll see that we get this, what are called inline form sets here in the Django admin. So I can add books with the title and the number of pages, and I can also delete them as well. But I'm just going to save this without any books. So we have one author being Bob. And this is, again, just so that we have something to start with. Before we take a look at HTMX, it's important to just understand how Django Formsets work. And I'm going to run through it relatively quickly. So if we come back here into our books app, which is where we're going to work out of. We're going to create a forms.py file, and we'll say from Django import forms. And then here we're going to, also we'll need our models. So I'll import the book, and we're going to create a form set to create as many books for an author in exactly the same way that it functions over here. So the idea would be that you can add books and then save, and it saves all the books that you added at once instead of having to create one book at a time, have the page reload, create another book, etc. So we're going to first create a form for the book, and this is just, in my opinion, a little bit better because you can customize the form in terms of styling and in terms of labels and all kinds of other information. So it's just better to start off with a form. So I'm going to create a model form, and this is then going to require the class meta, and the model is the book, and then we can specify the fields, which is just going to be the title and the number of pages. All right, so that's all we need for the form. Now to create a form set, we have a bunch of options that we can pick from. So if you go from django.forms.models, then you can import quite a bunch of things. So if I just put command space, or actually control space, then I get different options here to import. And you can see we get inline form set factory. You've also got the model form factory and the model form set factory. So these are different sort of functions or tools you can use to build form sets, which are basically what we see here. You take one form and you can replicate it as many times without having to write more code. So I'm going to use the inline form set factory, one, because this creates the same effect of inline forms here, but if you wanted to use any of the other ones, it's also fine. So just for an example, I'm going to use the inline form set factory, and then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say that the book form set equals to an inline form set factory. And there's a lot of arguments that are required here. So first, if you can actually see all the arguments, you have the parent model, which is the first thing, and then you have the model, you have form set. So there's a lot of different arguments that you can pass in here. The first is the parent model, and that's the author. So we need to import the author, and then we can specify it here. Then we specify the model that we're working with as the model that we want to create as many as we want. So that's that being the book. So we have the book, then we can specify the book form, and then you can specify other things like can delete, which means do you want to have the delete button here? So you could do that. You could set it to false if you don't want to show that. And you can add things like the minimum number. So the minimum number of books that need to be created. So you could say at least 2 books. And you can also specify something like extra, which means how many extra forms do you want to show. And for example, we could set this to 0, which means that we don't want any empty forms that are extra forms essentially being rendered in the form. And you can play with these arguments to see what this does. But basically, we'll take this form set and we'll bring it into views.py and use it here. So we'll say from our models, we'll import the models first. So the author and the book, and we'll say from forms, import the book form set. Then I'm going to create a function here, which is going to be a function-based view, and it's going to be, we'll call it create book, which is just going to take the request and the primary key. The primary key here is going to be used to grab the author so that we know which author to assign the book to. So here we can say that the author equals to author.objects.get, where the primary key is the primary key being passed in. And then we can say that the form set equals to the book form set, and we're basically passing in the request.post or none. And so if it's a post request, we're passing in that post data, otherwise it's just an empty form. And so at the end, we would then create some context and pass in the form, or you could call it form set, and pass in the form set, and then return a render of the request to some template. So we'll just say create book.html and then pass in the context. Now, if it's a post request, then we'll check for that here. So If it's a post request, then we'll check if the form is valid. So we check if the form set is valid. And if it is valid, then what we can do is save the form set. So you can say formset.save. And before we call this .save, we need to assign the books to an author, because right now we're not actually assigning it, and it requires that primary key. So for all the form sets, how they work is you have to pass in the instance. So this instance it's not a property of the model, it's just a property of the form sets. So we basically assign it to the parent model that we're creating all these books for. And then once you do that, then you can return either a render of the request again, or you could return a redirect, or whatever you want to do. So we could say return redirect, and we'll say the name of the view is going to be called create book. So we'll do that in a second. And because it requires primary key, we're going to pass the primary key in here again, which is basically just returning us back to this view. So we can take the view, and then we'll go into Django Htmx URLs, and we're going to work with it here. So we'll say from the books model or books app, we're going to say from the views, import create book, and then we'll create a path that takes in a primary key, and that primary key is the author ID. We're going to use that view, and then we'll call it create book. So at this point, you can check if everything's running. And if we come into the project and we go to /1, okay, so createbook.html is not created yet. So I'm going to go to settings and go down to the templates here. And then I'm going to say base.dir/templates so that it adds that as a folder. And then we can create the templates folder, and I'll create book.html. And then you can bootstrap some HTML template here. And all I'm going to do is just say create books for, and we could pass in the author here as well. So we'll say create books for author.name. And in order to have that in the context, then we need to pass the author in the context here as well. So I'll do that as well. Okay. So we need to add the form here. So this is going to be inside a form tag, and then we can just do form, and we'll make sure we add the CSRF token, and then we'll create a button so that we can submit the form. And we must specify that the method is post, right? So that's the basics of a form, or actually this is form set. And so normally when you work with a normal form, so when you work with normal forms, this is what you do. But when you work with, in this case, a form set, the form set has some extra properties. And so what we need to do is also render out what is the management form. So this, we'll see what this looks like in a second, but we need to do this. So just saving that, we can come back and refresh here. And you can see we have basically two forms being rendered out here, and what I'll do is put formset.asp so that it looks a little bit better. So we've got the title, number of pages, and create books for Bob, because this is number one, so author number one basically. And so we can try and submit this, and we get some basic field validation. So these are all individual forms, right? So I can go and test this out, and we'll just say this is test book number one, and we'll just say 200 pages and etc. And you can submit, and we get redirected back here. And if we were to go to the admin and go to the authors and go to this author, we can see there are those books, right? So the books were created, and that's how form sets work. Now, just going back to this form, I'm going to inspect the page, just bring this up. And so here inside the form, you can see a whole bunch of hidden inputs. And we've got the name of every input, which is book set dash total forms, initial forms, minimum number of forms, max, etc. And all of these are created by the management form that we output here. Now this information is important, and so when you work with form sets, when you want to make it a lot more dynamic by adding JavaScript so that you can press a button and it adds another row, and you can press a delete button and it deletes that row, it needs to change this information as well, because this is telling Django how many forms are being submitted. And so it's also important. And this is where it gets a bit complex when you work with form sets and you need to make things dynamic. So I was playing with HTMX and trying to get HTMX with form sets to work together. In my experience, was not great. It didn't seem like HTMX and form sets, at least when I talk about form sets, I mean this API, this way of building forms, does not really make sense with HTMX. And so the answer to using HTMX and form sets is actually just don't use form sets, just use forms. And so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you how you can use normal forms and you can create all the views and create a really dynamic feeling that achieves basically the exact same effect as what you get here in the admin when you need to add books like this. And you can click all these buttons and delete rows, but you don't need any JavaScript. So that's where HTMX comes in. So if we go to docs, then it tells you here HTMX is a library that allows you to access modern browser features directly from HTML rather than using JavaScript. So for example, if you click on examples and you go to click to edit, right, then you can see a demo at the bottom. Here you have a bunch of details, and if you click to edit, you can see it turns into a form, and then you can edit these details. And so if we just do this, submit, now you can see it returns that same response, but now it's been updated. And so the idea is that you get this very sort of React front-end rendered feeling, but really what's happening is it's HTML that's being sent, and then that response is just replacing the div or the initial content that was here. So it creates this really dynamic feeling because you don't have to have the page reload, and you only send back what's necessary to update this little piece of HTML here instead of the whole thing. So it's a very interesting concept, and it is actually really enjoyable once you've got it to work. So to get it installed, there are some packages that you can use to have it directly with Django, but it's pretty straightforward to just add it to your templates and work with it like that in the beginning. So first you just need to have the script. So I'm going to grab this, and then we're going to go to our templates. I'm going to create a base.html file because that's going to hold everything together. And then I'll just create the template like this, and we'll say HTMX and Django. Now there are some attributes here like hxpost and hxswap, and we'll get to those as we go through examples, but really you just need the script to get started. And then a sort of more Django specific requirement is to add a script in here, and I've just copied and pasted this in here. But basically you have a event listener on the document body, and it's listening for this event here, HTMX config request. And then on the callback, we add headers, and we're adding the XCSRF token header, which is a Django specific header, and it's the CSRF token context variable. So what's happening here is we're basically just making sure the headers contain the tokens so that we can send requests. And so you need to have this. This is mainly for post requests. For GET requests, this isn't necessary, but it's good to just add this in here. And then what we can do is in the body, I'll create a block, which we'll call content, and then end the block as well. And then in create book, we can remove quite a lot of stuff here and start by extending from base.html, and then wrap everything inside the block content and end block here. All right, so now we can just come back here and make sure that that is working correctly, right? So it's still there. And so the first thing is going to be, how do we get started with HTMX and the concepts that we saw in the example with what we want to achieve here, where we basically want this nice dynamic feel where we can add or click a button and it adds another form, and then we can populate that form, click submit, and it returns us the newly created book. All right, so the first thing is we're going to create a view that returns just this form, right? So it's not going to do anything else. It just returns an empty form. And this is nothing new. This is all the same Django stuff that you know with normal function-based views. So we'll create a function here, which will be create book form, which will take a request. And really all we're doing is just rendering or returning a render of the request with a template. So we'll put it inside a partials folder, which is basically going to indicate that it's a sort of component, if you want to call it that. It's not a whole page, it's just a partial piece of the page, really. And we'll just call it the book form. Okay, so it's just a form, and we'll get to it in a second. So this is going to be partials book form.html. And then the context we'll create in a second. So this context is just going to be a form, right? Only the form variable, and it's going to be the book form. Now, not the book form set, the book form. So this form here. We could actually delete the form set if we wanted to, but we'll get to it in a second. So the book form, just the form, is what we need. And it's empty, so meaning it's not for post requests. This is just for returning the empty state of the form. So we'll take that and bring it into the URLs. So go over here, and we can start by importing like this, right? And then we'll create a path here like HTMX. Let's do book form, and then the view, and then name book form. Okay. So the name here is very important. We're going to use the name in the template. And now going into the templates, we're going to go to this create book.html, and we can basically get rid of everything from here, or except for the button. I'll just keep the button. Right. And so what we want to do is make use of those attributes that we saw earlier over here, which is this hx post and hx swap. We can basically copy those attributes, paste them in here. And so this hx attribute tells you that it has to do with the HTMX project. And so the post tells you that it's going to send a post request when you click the button. And you can also do get request, you can do put, you can do delete. So there's all the different types of requests that you can send. In our case, we're just going to do a get request, not a post request. And then you get the swap attribute. And again, you can come here to docs. You can go to the swapping section. And so it says here, HTMX offers a few different ways to swap the HTML returned into the DOM. By default, the content replaces the inner HTML of the target element. You can modify this by using the hx swap attribute with any of the following values. So you can do inner HTML, outer, after begin, and you can read all of these. But right now, it's just the outer HTML. And so this isn't the one that we're going to go with. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a div here, and I'm going to give it an ID. We'll say that it's the book forms div. And so what we want is when we click this button, it's going to add the response to this div. So what we do is we use the before end property, and what that does, is say we had 5 forms in here already. Once you click it, it's going to add it to the end of this div with all the forms. So it'll be the 6th element inside this div. So it just adds it to the end. And there's one more attribute that we need to get this to work. Because we're referencing this div, we need to tell HTMX that we're not talking about this button, because right now if we were to click this, it would just look at this button, but we needed to have a target. And so the target, which we can do hx target, is basically hashtag book forms like you would do in CSS. So we're basically referencing the div with an ID of book forms, or the element with an ID of book forms, which is this. Now, lastly, here the URL needs to be replaced with the correct URL. So we're going to add the URL here, and the name is going to be the name from over here, which is book form. So put that in there. So basically, when we click the button, we send a GET request to this URL. That's going to return us an HTML response, and we're going to swap the response inside this div at the end, and that's really it. So we could say like add book, for example. So if we come and we refresh here and we click add book, and let's see, we're not getting a response there, and it's because here I have seemed to have deleted the extends tag here. Let's just get this back. All right, refresh here, create the book, and we can see if we click this as many times, it keeps adding a form to the end of the div. And like that, already we have a pretty dynamic feeling that's being achieved using forms and HTMX. And so you can get pretty creative with how you want the responses to work and what gets replaced. So for example, if we submit this form, we want it to return the details of that book. And so we'll go into the views first. So if we come over here, we're going to create a detail view, and this is going to look pretty similar to this function-based view here. This is going to be, let's just call it detail book, for example, and we're going to get the book by its primary key. So we're going to need to pass it in over here. And once we have the book, we then need to create some context and pass it into the context. So here's the book being passed in there, and then we'll call this the book detail.html, and then again bring it into the URLs. So we'll just do it here, and we'll do another HTMX view, for example, detail book, and it can be detail book, and then we'll add a primary key in the URL here, right? So it's book/primary key, use the detail book, and then there's the URL, right? So we've got the detail view. Now let's go back into the views. What we can do is inside the create book function, right? This is the function that's going to handle creating the actual book. We'll first need to change this from working with a form set to now working with the form, just the book form. So we can get rid of that and make book form the class to use. And then we don't have to call this form set. We can just say form. All right. So if the form is valid, then we will save the form, and we just need to change the instance to author, because now we're working with a single book form and we're assigning it to the author. And once we have saved it, we can then return a redirect to the detail view instead of just a form again. So we can say detail book, and then we can do something like this. We can say book equals to form.save, where commit is false. And then we can just change book or form to book like that. And then return with the primary key needed for this view to be the book ID. So we're basically returning a redirect to the detail view, and that will only happen if we successfully created the book. If we didn't successfully create the book, then it's going to return a render of this file, which is basically the entire template, right? That's this whole template that's being rendered. But we want to return something different if there are errors in the form. So we'll add an else statement here, and we're going to return a render, and we'll just pass in some context here with the form being the form, right? So this will take into account if there are errors on the form and we need to resubmit that form. But we don't need to return the entire template again. We can just return the partial template. So this is going to be partials and then book form.html. So let's see what this looks like in action. We'll refresh here, add a book. I can add a title here, and I'll put the number of pages as 1, let's just say. So we'll test this out, hit submit. And let's see, we get an error here on the name of the book, which needs to be detail book, not detail form. And we can actually try and resubmit that. Right, this time getting the template error, so that's going to be book underscore detail.html. And here we're being passed in the book as context, so we can just say book.title, and we'll say book.number of pages. Right, so that's like that. We can resubmit this, and we get another book, comma 1. Now notice it sends us to this URL, and that's not exactly what we want to do when we're working with HTMX. We just want the HTML response sent back and then replace that inside the DOM. So let's go back to number 1. If we have a form here, we want it to submit and just replace the form with that book detail we just saw. So the way that we can do that is if we come into the book form, we can wrap this entire form inside a div, and this is going to have some HTMX properties. The first is the X target, and this is going to be this, which means this whole div, right? This is the target to replace, and the HX swap attribute is going to be outer HTML, which basically means the whole HTML. So it's not going to be before the end or after the end. It's going to replace the entire div when we send a post request. And it's important just to add in another attribute here, which is the HX post attribute. And this makes sure that the button is sending an HTMX request, not a normal post request. If you leave this out, it's going to be a normal post request. So you need to add this in here. And here we're going to put dot, which basically means send to the current URL. It's the same thing as when you add the action value and you put a dot there. It means the same thing. It's like sending a request to the current URL. We can save this, and what will then happen is we'll have the form display. Once we hit the submit button, that's going to send a request to our create book view. It's going to be a post request, and then save the form and return an HTML response of the detail view, which is this view here, and that's only going to return a partial book detail template with the context. So seeing what this does, say we have a test book and you hit submit, you can see test book, 1, 2, 3 is the response, and no page reload, no redirect, it just gets replaced here. And so like that, you now have some HTMX inside your project and you're getting a nice dynamic feeling. Of course, we can style this later and make it look a little bit better, but right now the functionality is starting to come through. And you can imagine you would want to add an update button here and a delete button here as well. So that's what we'll work on next. So we go to the book detail view or detail template, and then here we can do things like we'll create a div, we'll do an H3 tag with the title, and then grab that, and we'll just put this in a paragraph tag, and we'll say number of pages, right? And so we'll then add the update button and the delete button. So we'll just make 2. This is going to be update and delete. And so the first one's going to have the HX get property, and then the second one is going to have the HX post property, because we're going to send a post request to delete the button. And we'll add those URLs in a second. So if you refresh here, here's another one, right? Then you can see there, update and delete, right? So there's one book detail coming through. And to make it easier, you can also come in over here. And what we'll do is we'll loop through all of the books. So we'll say for book in books, and then we'll end for. Then we can have either the book details here, or we can just include the partial template. So we can say partials book detail.html, and it will then render this template for every book. Now we just need to add the books to the context. So if you go to the create book view over here, we're going to add books, and this is just going to be, we'll do it up top here. It's going to be book.objects.filter, where the author is this author, and then we pass those books in there. So if you come back and refresh, then you can see all the books here, and then we can play around with all of them as we go along. So the delete view is probably the easiest one. So we'll do that one first. We'll come and basically replicate this function here and call this delete book. Again, takes in the same arguments, and we don't have to render any kind of request or HTML here. So we basically just call book.delete, and then we can return an HTTP response. So this comes from over here, http.response, and you don't actually have to return anything inside it, just an empty response like that. And then we'll bring it into the URLs. So bring that here. We'll basically duplicate this, and we'll say this is /delete. Then we need to import the delete book function and use it here, and then we'll say delete book. All right, so if you go to the template to the book detail, then here we're going to send this post request to a URL, which is going to be the book delete, right? Or delete book, opposite way around. And this takes in the book.id as an argument for the URL. So we can test this out. We come over here, I'll start deleting, and you can see it's getting rid of the button. So it's working, but it's not necessarily correct. And why this is the same reason as the book form. We need to add a target and the swap attribute to the entire div. All right, so it will delete the entire div here instead of just deleting the button. So if we refresh, you can see those are gone now because they were deleted. And now you can see it's really working. And you can also double check this by going into the admin, going to the author, and seeing that there is only one book. So that's also important just to check that. So that's the delete view working. Next is the update view. So we're going to create a view to, when we send a request, it will send back the form populated with that book. And this is going to look very similar to the create book form here, as well as this over here. It's going to look very similar. So we'll copy this, paste this here. This is going to be update book, and then we'll get rid of that. And like the other views, we grab the book from the primary key in the URL. So we need to pass this in here. And the book is the instance for the form. So we have to pass here instance equals book. And I'm going to assign this in the beginning like that, and then pass it like this. Right? So you have basically the same thing, the form being populated with the book. It's inside the context, and we're rendering out that book form. So it's basically just going to be rendered out populated, and then we'll bring it into the URLs. So you can do something like this. You can say /update to use the update book, give it a name, and then come into the template for the book detail, and we'll add the URL here. This is going to be update book, book.id. Okay. Refresh here. If I hit update, you can see it replaces the response with a populated form. But if you go and submit this, right, and you refresh here, you can see that it actually is just creating more, right? It's not updating that same book, it's creating more of them. And so to avoid this, what we can do is pass in the book into the context, and then inside the template, you can do if book, all right? Then we're going to have one type of button. Otherwise, we're going to have another type of button. So if there's no book, then we're just submitting to the current URL. But if there is a book, then we need to submit it to the update view, which is going to be another URL. And then just need to add the name in there. So this is going to be update book, and it's going to take the book ID, right? So update book, we'll just double check that that's correct. Update book, that takes the primary key, which is the book ID, and that's going to send a post request to this view. So then similarly to over here, we can copy all of that, paste this right over here. And then we'll also put in request.post or none, and then the instance, right? So making sure that we pass in the request.post if there is a post request. And then we can just say that book equals form.save. We're not updating the author anymore. So we'll just do that, book equals form.save, and return a redirect to the detail view so that it's the same response being returned. And then likewise return a render of the form. But here we're going to need to pass in the book again, because otherwise we don't have that context to update the book. Otherwise we'll be creating books again. So like that seems to be correct. And actually we're repeating ourselves in this whole block over here. So we can actually remove the else statement, because either way we're returning the form and rendering the same template here. So we have the book form with the post request, the instance, updating it, returning the detail view if it's successful, otherwise returning the same form and making sure we have that context. So coming back here, say we want to update the last one. I'm going to call this something else, right? If I hit submit, you can see the title's been updated, and we can also refresh the page to make sure. Right, I'll update the number of pages, and you can see that it's returning correctly. Right, so let's test the add form this time. So we'll do another book, and we'll say number of pages is 10. Submit, there's the book. All right, update it, and there we go. I can delete it, and there we go. Right, so that's all working. We have a pretty dynamic feeling now that we're achieving with HTMX, and this is functioning way better than what I think you would achieve with form sets and the amount of JavaScript that would be required to achieve it as well. Now, the last thing is just to make it look a little bit better, because it's always nice to make something that looks better. And so I'm just going to use Tailwind CSS because it's the easiest. So just opening up tailwindcss.com, you can go to the installation, and you can go to using the CDN, and then just grab the CDN link, and then coming into the templates, I'll paste the link here. All right, so we have it in the base.html, and you can also use the Django Tailwind package, which is better for production usage if you want to use Tailwind, but for what we're doing now, it's easier to test with the CDN. And then you can really style this however you want. So just as an example, I'm going to copy over some style I've got from the blog post. So I'm going to wrap the blocks here in a div. So it gives a little bit of a nice central look to everything. And then if we go into the createbook.html file, I'm going to paste everything in here and just make sure that the names of the URLs are correct. Right, so coming back, refresh here, you can see this is what it looks like. If you click add form, that's still working. Cool. You can then go to the book detail and you can replace it with all of this, right? Again, you can get all of this from the blog post, so you don't have to watch me type all of the HTML out. All right, again, click update and that seems to work. Click delete and that seems to work as well, okay? And then lastly, it's the book form. We can update this as well. So I'm just grabbing the HTML here as well. Replace everything there. Click to add a form and you can see this is what you get. So let's say test. All right, hit submit. There we go. And then the last thing is really to make the forms look better. So you can use the crispy forms package, which is really the go-to if you want to make something look better. All right, so just grab that to install, pip install, and I'll also freeze the requirements. And then we'll also install the Tailwind crispy forms extension or template pack, which is this here. It's on the Django crispy forms organization. And also just have to install the package. All right, I'll freeze that as well. And then we can basically just grab all of that. That's all we need to install it. So going into settings, then I'll actually run the server. All right, then we can come up here to installed apps because we need to add these two. So we'll do that. And then it's just the allowed template pack being Tailwind and being the specified template pack. So going into book form, all you need to do then is just load the template, which is over here, or not the template tag. So load Tailwind filters, and then you can do the crispy template like that. So just replacing that. Refresh here, we'll click update, and then you can get it looking like this. And you've got a very nice looking dynamic set of forms. And it took no JavaScript at all. Of course, you can improve on this and improve on the UI and a bunch of different aspects, but the main point is just showing how you can achieve a really nice dynamic functionality and just look and feel with very little code and no real extra logic outside of how you've been working with Django all this time. So Htmx definitely has a place in this world, particularly for Django development, I think. So if you enjoyed the tutorial, then consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.